Hello and welcome to my channel. In today's video, we're going to explore one of the most solid defenses, the Caro-Kann defense, which starts with e4, c6. Normally here white plays pawn to d4, quite principled move, and then you play pawn to d5, challenging the e4 pawn. Now white has several moves to choose from. Let's have a look first on the exchange variation, which happens after white takes the d5 pawn and you recapture it. In this position, white has two ways to play. The first option is bishop to d3, simply starting to develop pieces, which marks the main line. Then you can respond with a knight to c6, attacking the d4 pawn. White plays pawn to c3, defending the pawn, and you develop your other knight to f6. White plays bishop to f4 and you respond with bishop to g4, attacking the queen. White then retreats their queen to b3. This line is considered to offer white a slightly better game, but the game is still up to even, with equal chances for both sides. Going back to the earlier position, here white also can play pawn to c4, which marks pan of attack. You develop your knight to f6 and white plays knight to c3. Now I recommend you to play pawn to e6 in order to reinforce the d5 pawn. And after knight to f3, you can play either bishop to b4, creating a pin, or bishop to e7. This system often leads to typical isolated queen's pawn positions, with white obtaining rapid development and kingside attacking chances to compensate for the long-term structural weakness of the isolated d4 pawn. Let's go back. Next on the list is a more typical and common move, pawn to e5, which marks the advance variation. Here you have two ways of playing. You can play pawn to c5, putting pressure on d4 pawn. White responds with a pawn to c3, trying to build a solid structure of pawns. You develop your knight to c6. White develops their knight to f3, reinforcing the d4 pawn. Now you play bishop to g4, creating a pin. Then if they play bishop to e2, you take the knight to destabilize the center, and after they recapture, you play pawn to e6. Now the d4 pawn becomes the target of your attack. In this position, black has very good chances to dominate the game. Going back, another option you can choose is bishop to f5. This is considered the main line. White has several moves to choose from. They can play knight to c3, and after you play pawn to e6, they respond with pawn to g4, which marks the aggressive bayonet attack. Another option for white is to play knight to f3, and after pawn to e6, bishop to e2, you play pawn to c5. Then white will likely play bishop to e3, reinforcing the d4 pawn and putting pressure on c5 pawn. Then you can take the d4 pawn and start to simply develop your pieces. Returning to the previous position, white can also play pawn to h4, which marks the Tal variation. Here you can't play pawn to e6, because after pawn to g4, bishop to e4, pawn to f3, bishop to g6 and pawn to h5, your bishop is trapped. So to prevent this you need to respond with a pawn to h5 and continue then to simply develop your pieces. Going back to the earlier position, another option for white here is to play knight to c3, which marks the classical variation. You take the pawn and they recapture it with the knight. Here you can play either knight to f6 or bishop to f5. Let's start with a knight to f6. They will likely play knight captures f6, and then again you have two options on how to respond. If you recapture it with the g-pawn, which marks the Braunstein-Larsen variation, then you have voluntarily opted for an inferior pawn structure and a practical necessity of castling queenside, while gaining dynamic compensation in the form of the open g-file for the rook. Another option is to play e-pawn takes f6, which marks the Tartakower variation. This decision offers black rapid development, though also ceding white the superior pawn structure and long-term prospects. Returning to the beginning of classical variation, as was said, another option for black is to play bishop to f5, attacking the knight. Then such position can occur: knight to g3, bishop to g6, pawn to h4, pawn to h6, knight to f3, knight to d7, pawn to h5, bishop to h7, bishop to d3, bishop takes, queen takes. In this position, although white's pawn on h5 looks ready to attack, it can prove to be a weakness in an endgame, but with accurate play from white the position should be close to equality. That's it for today's video on the Caro-Kann defense and its variations in chess. Hope you enjoyed it. It covers basically all you need to start playing this opening, and after you practice a bit, you can then dive deeper and deeper in the nuances of this opening. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more chess-related content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.